My name is Clara Vance. I'm 32 years old and I work as a civil litigation paralegal in Cincinnati, Ohio. 3 days before my sister-in-law's lavish wedding, my husband stood in our kitchen, poured himself coffee from a machine I bought, and told me I needed to pack my bags. His mother had decided that our 4-bedroom historic colonial, the home my late father left solely to me, was the rightful wedding gift for his golden child sister. He said it calmly, the way you'd announce a shift in the weather. Be reasonable, Clara. Chloe is starting a real family. You have your job. You can easily rent a 1-bedroom apartment near the courthouse. Behind him on the granite island sat my house keys, already attached to his sister's monogrammed keychain. I didn't yell. I didn't slam a door. I simply picked up my work briefcase, walked out of my own home, and let them believe I had surrendered. What my husband and his mother didn't know was that while they were popping champagne in my living room and rearranging my father's antique furniture for wedding photos, I was sitting across from a county judge with 10 years of bank statements, an unrecorded trust document, and an emergency eviction warrant signed in black ink. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally stop paying for seats at tables that were never set for them. If you've ever been the one expected to sacrifice everything while everyone else takes the credit, this story is for you. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. To understand how my husband thought he could give away my front door, you have to understand the family I married into 4 years ago. Mark Caldwell was handsome, polished, and carried a surname that once owned half the lumber mills in Hamilton County. When we met, I was 28, buried in probate filings, still grieving my father who had passed from lung cancer 6 months prior. Mark seemed like solid ground. He listened to me talk about property law, brought me soup when late courthouse filings ran past midnight, and never once asked how much my father had left me. His mother, Eleanor Caldwell, lived in a sprawling Georgian estate with 6 white columns and a mortgage she hadn't paid down in 15 years. In the Caldwell family, image wasn't a preference, it was a religion. They drove leased luxury sedans, held charity galas on maxed out credit lines, and spoke of other people's hard work as if it were a minor social defect. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was 26, blonde, and possessed the terrifying ability to turn every conversation into an audit of what she was owed. 2 years ago, when she got engaged to Harrison, a boy whose family owned 3 car dealerships, Eleanor declared that the wedding must reflect the Caldwell legacy. The problem was that the Caldwell legacy had exactly $400 left in its checking account. For 3 years, I had been the silent patch on their sinking ship. When Eleanor's property taxes were 3 days from a county tax lien, Mark came to me with tears in his eyes, and I quietly wired $14,000 to the county treasurer. When Chloe crashed her sports coupe without collision insurance, my savings covered the body shop so her fiancé's family wouldn't find out. I never asked for a promissory note. I never brought it up over Sunday pot roast. In my mind, I was investing in a family. In their minds, they had simply found a tenant who paid them in silence. The house on Sycamore Ridge had been built by my great-grandfather in 1928. It had 3 fireplaces, oak pocket doors, and a wraparound porch where my father taught me how to read court filings when I was 12. When Dad died, he left the property to me in an irrevocable living trust. Not to me and my future spouse, to me alone. Dad was a real estate surveyor for 40 years. He knew that the easiest way to lose a family home was to let marriage laws blur the lines. Keep the deed in the trust, Clara, he told me on his hospice bed. A house with one owner never has an argument about who holds the key. Mark moved into Sycamore Ridge the month we married. He brought his suits, his golf clubs, and gradually his family's expectations. First, it was hosting Thanksgiving for 40 relatives because Eleanor's dining room had bad lighting for photographs. Then, it was storing Chloe's seasonal wardrobes in my guest closets. Every time I pushed back, Mark deployed the sentence his mother had taught him. Family shares what it has, Clara. Don't be small-minded. Small-minded. It is remarkable how quickly people who bring nothing to the table will call you selfish for wanting to keep your own plate. The trap sprung on a Tuesday in September. I arrived home early from the courthouse to find Eleanor, Chloe, and an interior designer measuring my living room windows. Chloe was pointing at the crown molding my father had carved by hand, saying, "We'll paint all of this high-gloss white. It looks too rustic for the reception photos." Mark was leaning against the mantel, holding a glass of scotch, smiling like a proud host. When I asked what was happening, Eleanor set down her fabric swatch, looked at me with that patronizing, sweet church smile, and said, "Darling, Mark and I had a long talk. The wedding is 60 guests larger than expected. Chloe and Harrison need a proper estate to begin their marriage, and this house fits the Caldwell standard perfectly." I turned to my husband. Mark didn't flinch. "We're transferring the deed into Chloe's name as her wedding gift tomorrow, Clara. You and I can move into that high-rise downtown. It's much closer to your paralegal office anyway. I stood in my own hallway looking at 3 adults who had carved up my father's heritage between lunch and cocktails without a single legal right to the soil under their feet. Mark held out a manila folder with a quitclaim deed prepared by a strip mall notary already flagged with yellow sign here tabs. Sign it tonight so the title company can rush the filing before the rehearsal dinner on Friday. I looked at the yellow tab. I looked at Eleanor's pearls. I took a slow, steady breath, the kind I take before filing a motion for summary judgment. I'll look it over tonight, I said quietly. They took it as defeat. Chloe squealed and hugged her brother. Eleanor patted my cheek and said, I always knew you had good breeding underneath it all, dear. They left at 6 to go to a cake tasting, leaving their fabric samples on my father's dining table. By 7, I had packed 2 suitcases with my clothes, my father's original blueprints, and the green leather binder holding the Sycamore Ridge Living Trust. By 8, I was sitting in the corner booth of a 24-hour diner with my firm's senior partner, Arthur Vance. Arthur had practiced property law for 45 years. He adjusted his glasses, reviewed the quitclaim draft Mark had tried to force on me, and then read through my father's trust. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Your husband's notary is an idiot, Clara, Arthur said, tapping the table with his pen. They attempted to convey property held in an active, unrevoked trust without trustee authorization. That's not a transfer. That's attempted deed fraud, and if they enter that home without your permission after notice, that's criminal trespass. What about the wedding rehearsal? I asked. They have 40 people arriving on Friday evening for a catered dinner on my lawn. Arthur closed the folder and looked at me with eyes that had seen 100 greedy families tear themselves apart. Do you want to stop the dinner, or do you want to end the entitlement? I want to end it, I said. Then we file an emergency injunction at 9 a.m. Friday, Arthur said calmly. We have the sheriff execute personal service at 6:30 p.m., right between the soup and the salad. Thursday was entirely quiet. Mark texted me twice, asking where I was. I replied that I was staying near the office to finish a heavy filing schedule. He replied, Good. Make sure you bring the signed deed to the rehearsal tomorrow night. Mom wants to frame it for the gift table. I didn't answer. Friday morning at 9:15, Arthur and I stood before Magistrate Judge Patricia Holloway in courtroom 4B. In 15 minutes, using the recorded 1998 trust deed, my father's tax receipts, and the fraudulent quitclaim paperwork Mark had texted me, Judge Holloway signed 3 documents. 1. An emergency protective order excluding Mark Caldwell and all third parties from the premises of Sycamore Ridge. 2. A temporary restraining order freezing any encumbrances on the property. 3. An immediate writ of ejectment authorizing the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department to remove all unauthorized persons. At 5 p.m., 40 guests in tuxedos and evening gowns arrived at my house. Caterers set up silver chafing dishes on my lawn. String lights illuminated the ancient oak trees. At 6:15 p.m., I pulled up across the street in Arthur's sedan. Through the front windows, I could see Eleanor holding court near the fireplace, wearing an emerald gown, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by Chloe's wealthy future in-laws. Mark stood beside her, checking his watch, clearly looking for his obedient wife to arrive with the paperwork. At 6:28 p.m., 2 county patrol cruisers pulled into the driveway, their headlights cutting through the romantic amber lighting. Deputy Sheriff Miller, a man who had known my father for 30 years, stepped out holding the court orders on a steel clipboard. Arthur and I walked up the driveway behind him. The music stopped when the uniform crossed the threshold. Eleanor rushed to the door with her hostess smile pinned in place. Officer, is there a parking issue on the street? We have permission from the neighborhood association for our daughter's rehearsal. Deputy Miller didn't smile. Are you Eleanor Caldwell? I am Mrs. Caldwell, yes. He handed her the first envelope. You are being served with a formal notice of criminal trespass and an emergency court order. This property is private residential land owned exclusively by the Sycamore Ridge Trust. Every person in this house has 15 minutes to collect their personal belongings and vacate the premises. The room went dead. A wine glass slipped and shattered on the hardwood. Mark pushed through the crowd, his face flushed red. This is a ridiculous misunderstanding. I live here. This is my house. Arthur stepped forward from the shadow of the porch. It was never your house, Mark. You are a non-owner occupant whose tenancy was terminated at 8 a.m. this morning by the sole trustee. I stepped into the light of the entryway. The silence that followed was complete. Chloe stared at me from the center of the room, her veil half-pinned, clutching her champagne flute like a shield. Eleanor's face went through 3 distinct shades of gray. Clara! Eleanor hissed, dropping her voice to an urgent, furious whisper. What is the meaning of this spectacle? Harrison's parents are standing right there. Sign the paper and tell these men to leave. I looked at my mother-in-law. I looked at the broken glass on my father's floor. "There is no paper, Eleanor," I said in the quiet, steady voice I use in front of juries. "I never signed the deed. I never will. You spent 4 years telling everyone I had nothing to offer this family. Tonight, I'm simply taking my nothing back." "You can't do this to my sister on her wedding weekend," Mark yelled, his hand shaking as the guests began hurriedly gathering their coats. "You're destroying this family over a house." "No, Mark," I said, meeting his eyes for the last time. "You destroyed this family the moment you priced my father's memory at the cost of your sister's approval." Deputy Miller checked his watch. 10 minutes, folks. If the lawn isn't clear, we start issuing citations for the county jail. The evacuation was not graceful. Harrison's parents left first without saying goodbye to Eleanor, their luxury sedan throwing gravel as they backed out of the driveway. The caterers packed up their half-warmed tenderloin under the watchful eye of 2 armed deputies. Chloe sat on the porch steps, sobbing into her silk gown, while Mark threw his golf clubs and suitcases into the trunk of his leased car. Eleanor stood on the lawn, her emerald dress catching the streetlights, looking at the dark windows of the house she had tried to steal, realizing that for the first time in 40 years, she had run out of people who would pay for her pride. By 8 p.m., the cruisers pulled away. The locksmith I had hired finished installing commercial deadbolts on all 4 exterior doors. I walked through the quiet rooms of Sycamore Ridge alone. The silence in the house was immense, but it wasn't lonely. It was clean. The air smelled of wood smoke and old cedar, exactly the way it had when my father was alive. I sat on the front porch swing in the dark, listening to the crickets in the yard. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Mark received exactly $0 from the Sycamore Ridge Trust, and the court ordered him to repay the $14,000 I had loaned for his mother's delinquent taxes. Chloe's wedding was postponed indefinitely. Harrison's family quietly withdrew their blessing after the county filings became public record. My mother-in-law moved into a small rented duplex across the river, where no one asks about her family crest. And yesterday, I sat at my father's desk under the morning sun, looked out at the sycamore trees, and wrote a single line in the front of my legal ledger. A seat at someone else's table will cost you everything you own, but a table you built yourself will always keep you safe. That's my story. 1 Ford deed, 2 police cruisers, and a front door that finally learned how to lock. If someone in your life is asking you to make yourself small so their ego can look grand, take this as your sign. Stop paying the rent on a family that treats you like a stranger. Share this story with someone who needs the courage to hold their line. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.